Ellen Blackler. I'm the moderator. We're going to start off with Alexander Dix is going to give us some introductory remarks, and then we'll move to a discussion amongst our panelists, who I will introduce when we get to that point. So, with that.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm very grateful to be able to introduce this session. When I was asked to do so, I wondered what nudge actually means. I'd never heard that word before. Actually, when I arrived here in my hotel, I saw in the elevator a button which says nudging on it. It's below the Shabbat button. I don't know if it's related to Shabbat. Maybe someone can explain me what that means. I haven't found out yet. You cannot press it, but it does have some significance. I don't know. Well, you will wonder what nudging actually means, and I will, first of all, give you a short introduction. Actually, there's a very popular book on the market, and I would strongly advise you to look at it. It's written by two Chicago professors, one economist and one law professor, Thaler and Sunstein. It's called Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness. I'm not receiving any money for doing advertisement for this, but it's really good reading. And this is really explains what this is all about. There is a definition there. To nudge is to push mildly or poke gently in the ribs, especially with the elbow. That's what nudge means. And there's a differentiation and difference to be made. It should not be confused with nudge. As William Safire has explained in the New York Times at one stage, the Jiddishism nudge is a noun meaning pest, annoying nag, persistent complainer. So there's a difference between nudge and nudge, and we are here talking only about nudges and nudgers. So nudging, to give you two practical examples, somewhat weird examples, but quite illustrative. A wonderful example of this principle comes from the men's rooms at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. There, the authorities have etched the image of a black housefly into each urinal. It seems that men usually do not pay much attention to where they aim, which can create a bit of a mess. But if they have a target, attention, if they have a target, they see a target, attention and therefore accuracy are much increased. According to the men who came up with the idea, it works wonders. It improves the aim, says Ad Kieboom. If a man sees a fly, he aims at it. Kieboom, an economist, directs Schiphol's building expansion. His staff conducted fly-in urinals trials and found that etchings reduce spillage by 80%. Another example is even more, illustrative, I think. This is the clocky example. Consider the alarm clock clocky. It's pictured in here, actually. Clocky is the alarm clock that runs away and hides if you don't get out of bed. With clocky, the planner or an individual sets the number of snooze minutes he will be permitted in the morning to carry on sleeping after the first bell has rang. When that number runs out, the clock jumps off the nightstand and moves around the room, making annoying sounds. The only way to turn the damn thing off is get out of bed and find it. By that time, even a groggy individual is awake. So this is quite illustrative, I think, what nudging really means. In a more theoretical approach, you can term it as, or even philosophical, you can term it as a method of libertarian or soft paternalism. And what we want to discuss here today is to use this as an additional tool to enhance and to improve privacy. And the question is, in what circumstances that could possibly work. Yesterday, and even on Monday evening, Jeff Rosen quoted one example how this can be used on the web. If you want to upload your pictures, your holiday pictures from Cancun, you might get a notice asking you, do you really want to upload these pictures? Or yesterday, random reminders were mentioned, and Professor Acquisti, who has done basic research in this field from the point of view of behavioral economics, quite rightly yesterday said, and this is quoted, is also a main theme in Thaler and Sunstein's book, that people have a strong tendency to go along with the default option. The default option is key. People tend to stick with the status quo, and therefore default settings are probably the most powerful nudges we have. Therefore, and again to quote Alessandro Acquisti yesterday, one of the most important sentences said yesterday, I think, was, there is no such thing as a neutral default. Someone is taking a decision, and maybe he's taking it for you. And this is, I think, the key, a recurrent theme in this conference in the term of nudges. We are revisiting that from another side, maybe, and the question is, who's taking that decision and in what direction it is being taken? Nudges may also have limits and some dangers, possibly. They may border on manipulation, possibly, and the question is to what extent we need transparency. This is also being discussed in the context of subliminal advertisements, for instance. One could think of subliminal advertisements in favor of privacy. Is that a good thing? Or should we opt for openness, complete openness in this respect? So these are some of the issues we want to discuss, and I'm very much looking forward to the panelists who have, I think, interesting things to show to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we thought we would do today is start with some of the privacy nudges that are out there today, and we'll hear from our panelists the kinds of things that they see, maybe some that they use, and then we'll move into some of the more future things we should be thinking about in terms of both tools and nudges that need to be developed, and also some of the whole new kinds of technologies and what we need to do to be prepared for that. We've got Scott Shipman, Lori Craner, and Sarah Spikerman. Did I get that right? With us today. You can read their bios. I will also make a disclaimer on their behalf that people are speaking here as individuals, not on behalf of their organizations. And we'll just jump into it. We also have some slides. We're going to try to integrate those into the discussion that we're having, so it may be a little tricky as we try to be creative. We'll see if we can pull that off. First, let's just talk about what are some of the privacy tools and nudges that are out there today that work, maybe not perfectly, but are available for people. And Lori, I'll start with you.
All right. So I wanted to mention today some of the tools that we've been developing at Carnegie Mellon in this privacy nudge space. One of the things that we've been looking at is privacy policies.
I forgot to interrupt you. If you want your slides, just let them know and they'll put them up there.
Yeah. Can we have
and
the
here's
slides,
the
please?
remote and the wheel on the side. The wheel on the side brings them up and down. Yeah. Okay. So you're the second slide. Go down. Nope, go up.
Not
further.
All right. I don't know how to use
there.
This thing. That's what I want. Okay. Okay. So we've been looking at privacy policies, and as we all know, they're really hard to read and understand, and nobody reads them. And so we've been looking at, can we give consumers tools that make it easy for them to get the essence of a privacy policy very quickly? And so we developed something called Privacy Finder, which you can try out yourself at privacyfinder.org. And so you can do a search here, and let's see if we can get slides to work. Okay, so here we've done a search for books, and we've gotten back some bookstore results. And you can see on the left column there's the green bar is a privacy meter. Basically what we've done is we've taken the computer readable privacy policies that some of these websites had called P3P, and we've automatically interpreted them and came up with a privacy score for each of these sites. And the ones that have those yellow birds are sites that don't have a proper P3P policy, so they get the bird. But the green bar gives you some idea about their privacy policy, and you can see which is better. And then you can click on the privacy report, and we've developed what we call our privacy nutrition label. And the idea here is to have a standardized format, very much like the nutrition label on a box of food, and that allows you to put the policies from multiple websites side by side. So we could go and compare the privacy policies from these various bookstores and determine which one is going to best meet our needs. So I'll hand it over.
Great. Is there anyone else who has a privacy tool they'd like to share? Go ahead, Scott.
I think there's a number of tools, and I think what we've heard already this morning, and certainly in the last 2 days, is we're seeing technology really begin to innovate. And if I can just quickly summarize, even the opening panel, I heard Facebook, Facebook, Google, Google, Facebook, Facebook, Google, 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 and some of those comments were positive, but I think many of them were fearful. And I'd have to highlight that those companies are innovating and pushing to create technology that does enable consumers to implement privacy controls. Now, how they came out of the gate, could be argued one way or the other, but I think the key point here is that we're seeing quick innovation. When problems are brought to light, we're seeing quick innovation. And so when you say, well, what types of tools are out there, I think there are many tools out there. I'm familiar on the board of directors of a web application phone startup, and they enable you to know who has your contact information in their cell phone, and if it's wrong, and allow you to send an update and update it, right? So you actually get to know where your information is in mobile phones and correct it. Now that's a privacy enabling app, right? When you look at companies like PayPal, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, companies like PayPal enable you to pay without giving someone your credit card number. How many people went out for dinner or are planning on going out for dinner this evening and paying with a credit card? A lot of hungry people in the room, I guess. When you hand someone your credit card, do they stay in sight the whole time? Or do they go around the corner and hopefully you trust that they just swipe it and come back? That's a trust model that we have, but yet many people are burned. Paying without having to even provide your credit card to someone is a privacy-enhancing technology.
Yeah, as in preparation of this panel, I've been thinking a little bit about privacy too, and I think it's a real dilemma that besides the settings that we can manipulate in our browsers or the default settings that we simply confront, we actually have a very dispersed field of privacy tools. So many people have created small applications, and unfortunately there is no standard, there is no consent on what kind of tools should be used by users. And I would like to, I thought about a structure of what kind of tools we'd actually need, and one dimension is certainly to raise awareness and to give people information about where they are in terms of privacy. And I think, Laurie, you just presented the privacy bird technology based on P3P, which shows the privacy policy of a company, which raises the awareness of the user for the policies of the company. And there are also small tools like Profile Watch that you can use to understand whether the settings in your Facebook are privacy appropriate, etc. So you raise awareness. But then the most important step is the second step, which is to take control. And at that point, to take control, it's not only a matter of changing your default settings, it also goes beyond that. It goes to the point where actually we have to ask, don't we have the right to delete our data? To what extent shall I have access and the automatic possibility to delete anything that I said? And there was this interesting incident with Facebook earlier in the year. I have been searching for the name of this application which allowed Facebook users to instantly delete their entire profile. And it took Facebook, I believe, a week to take it off the platform. And I haven't been able to find even the name of that application.
They did a good job.
It's completely gone. And when you think about it, Facebook did introduce recently now the possibility that you can delete your profile or you can deactivate it, and if you don't use it for an entire 2 weeks after, presumably it's being deleted. But how do you know? And I think at that point, when we think about privacy applications, we do not only need to ask whether we get control, but how we can be sure that these controls are actually lived by. So I believe if users really want to take control, they need to be able to use third parties who they trust, for example, in order to take care of delete options.
So we'll get back to this trusted entity issue in a minute, but I want to spend a second talking about customer adoption of these tools, because we've just said that there are a lot of tools out there. There's things that consumers can do. I'll go back to Lori, because I know she's kind of labored in the fields on this issue in a while and has done a lot of great work providing this kind of information to consumers. What do you see as the barriers to consumers adopting this technology in their daily internet life?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of barriers, and when you talk to companies about this, one of the things that they say is, well, it doesn't seem that consumers really want these things. You know, they're not adopting them, and so we've done some research on it. And let me go back to here. One of the things that we did is we tested Privacy Finder to see if we gave it to consumers, would it actually change their browsing behavior? And so we did a study where we actually paid them to go shopping online, and we had one group that saw these privacy meters and another group that didn't. And we controlled the prices of the items. Basically, they were using real credit cards, real personal information, but we controlled what search results they would actually see. So they would only see companies they'd never heard of, so they wouldn't be biased. And what we found is that if people had no privacy information, they would just shop from whichever company had the item at the lowest price. And if we provided the privacy meters, we had a substantial fraction of our participants who would then go and pay like 50 cents more to shop at the site with a better privacy policy. And so, you know, we showed that consumers, if they're given that information right there in their search results, they will actually act on it. So why aren't we given that information in our search results except in this little prototype thing running in our little university lab? Well, so there are a lot of players that all have to cooperate to make this actually happen. We need all of the websites to put this P3P code on their websites. And when you go and talk to the websites, they say, well, we don't really have an incentive to do that. What's in it for us to go and put this P3P code on our website? We already have a privacy policy. Why should we add this? We also need the web browsers and the search engines to actually build tools like this. And what we've seen is Microsoft Internet Explorer has some P3P functionality, and that's about it right now. And so, you know, I go talk to the search engines, I talk to the web browsers, and they say, well, there aren't that many websites that have this, and consumers aren't demanding it, so why should we build it? And so kind of everybody's pointing fingers at each other. And then in the meantime, due to the way that Microsoft actually implemented P3P, it's actually spurred some adoption of P3P because they use it as part of their cookie blocking functionality. But we've done a recent study where we found that about 1/3 of the websites who adopted it actually have errors in their policy, and it appears that the errors are there to avoid having Microsoft block their cookies. So we just have a big breakdown. So, you know, what are the obstacles? Well, many, many obstacles of getting people, different companies to cooperate and getting enough incentives to make this actually happen.
You know, that's very interesting. We talk a lot in the advertising area about how the whole ecosystem has to act together to get the kind of data collected for advertising purposes in a more kind of privacy-central regime. And I think this is a really clear example of a path that could be followed, but there's no kind of one person who can do it. Alexander, I wonder if you have any thoughts about, you know, what that means from the regulator's perspective when you've got this range of entities that have to act, including consumers, to make a more transparent environment.
Well, I would say that certainly as a regulator, I take the view that privacy is too important as only to be left to the market forces. But I can, on the other hand, see that we are here talking about a tool or a mechanism which could deliver additional effects, positive effects, beyond the mere compliance with legal rules. So we're talking about raising awareness. We're talking about giving incentives to providers and players in the online world. But that should be distinguished, I think, from strict legal obligations. That is something they have to be enforced, certainly, and I'm strongly in favor of having a legal framework which provides for privacy-friendly default settings. That is my personal view. I don't see this at the moment. We are recommending privacy-friendly default settings, and we have achieved, for instance, with one German social network, the largest social network, in fact, in Germany, to get them to have privacy-friendly default settings in their network. Facebook has now adopted, to say something positive about them for a change. They have privacy-friendly default settings for under 18 people. Now, a lot of users probably lie about their age, so that's kind of virtual discussion, but at least they're saying we have different default settings and we see the need for greater privacy protection for a certain group of our users, and that's a first step at least. I would strongly want to have these settings for all users without distinction of age, but I do see a problem there to mix the regulatory field in the strict sense and what we're talking here about at the moment. So we should also discuss in what direction nudges should point, or nudges are certainly something I think you cannot be nudged to behave legal. That is a different aspect of your behavior, but you can be nudged to avoid being surveilled by someone else who would act illegally, and you could protect yourself by following a nudge, for instance. So that's maybe an incomplete answer to your question.
What do you think about what Larry Strickling talked about today, about kind of the important role of a self-regulatory framework, and how that seems to me to be, with an enforcement, he had some phrase that included robust enforcement, but it seemed to me there's some opportunity there where you need this kind of inter-industry cooperation to get some of the details of a cooperation regime down. What do you think the potential of that is from a regulator's perspective?
Well, I'm a little bit skeptical about the chances of having real results if we choose only the way of self-regulation. I'll give you an example from RFID technology. We have tried in Germany and even in Europe to get the RFID producers to agree to a privacy-friendly setting of, I'm talking now about RFID technology in the retail industry, to have deactivation at the point of sale built into these chips from the start. I would be glad if the industry would agree to would agree themselves voluntarily that they would produce the technology from the start in this privacy-friendly way, but they wouldn't agree to that expressly, and that's why we are now calling for regulation in that direction. So this is, I think, logical. I'm happy to give self-regulation a chance, but if it doesn't come around, if it doesn't deliver results, I think the regulators have to step in.
Well, I'm glad you brought up RFID, because we're going to do some deep dive into that in a little bit, but I don't want to get there yet, because I want to finish up on some of the nudges that exist now. I did want to ask, in a lot of ways we talk about what exists today with respect to the way people are collecting and using data when we talk about the regulatory regime, but after this morning's session and really yesterday, what we hear a lot about of concern is the social networking, which is really a little bit of a different animal, and about this right to be forgotten and the kind of role of user-generated content. And I wonder, are you guys aware of any tools that address that? Is there a way for a customer today is there a tool or an add-on or something they can do that tells them what pictures are out there about them, what other user-generated content is out there about them, or something to help them delete information about them on the internet?
Well, I mean, there's a number of internet websites, there's a number of business models that provide that service, right? But if you look at how they're going to provide it, they have to go out and search and scrape and find and gather all of that data to then let you know where it came from. And so I think one of the downsides of any regulatory framework is in the absolutes, right? So if you have a framework principled on collection, then even the privacy-enhancing website that is seeking to tell you where your information is can't go out and collect it unless there's an appropriate use. And so when you're looking at collection-based frameworks or use-based frameworks, something that eBay has been advocating for a long time is that the federal government in the U.S. needs to evaluate a use-based framework. We heard earlier, and I would certainly argue in opposition, that this collection-based regime we need to get back to. I think that that's false. To focus solely on collection is a fallacy, right? I mean, the data is out of the bottle, the genie is out of the bottle, and if you have regimes that only base controls on collection, you're missing it, right? Because companies, governments, individuals have the information and will continue to give the information willingly, which means we need to focus on use-based controls. Use-based controls, not in absentia of collection-based principles, provide the accountability for companies to offer services that can go out and find your information and tell you, these are the pictures that we've found you on the internet. This is who has your information in their cell phones. These are the types of uses that we want to enable.
I was just going to mention a different type of tool related to that is not so much the guy in the back room waving. Is that at me?
I think
no?
there's
Okay.
someone there.
Okay. All right. So there are tools that don't tell you just what is out there, but also help you figure out your own controls on Facebook. So one of the problems a lot of people have is they think they've set things up so that only their friends can see it, and in fact they're broadcasting to the world. And so there have been a number of tools put out there that let you kind of do a self-check on your Facebook settings to make sure you understand what you're really doing. And so I think those kinds of things can be useful for consumers as well.
I think deletion is already difficult on the internet because there are services that regularly save and back up all pages on the internet. And so you may be deleting your Facebook profile, but if somebody has an interest into looking into your history on the internet, he just buys that service, backup service, or access to that backup service. So that's one thing. On the other hand, here at this point I believe very much in legislation, and in Germany we do have some strong regulation as far as data storage is concerned. for example, companies are only allowed to keep their data about their customers or their customer data as long as this data is needed for specific purposes, mostly billing purposes. But Mr. Dix will probably be able to comment on that in more detail and all the debates that are currently around that, because obviously there are interests into keeping data for a longer period of time. However, there are now also economic incentives developing, political incentives developing for CEOs, for example, to make sure the data is deleted. Just because if data is not deleted, it can be abused, and we have a few major CEOs that had to basically quit their jobs because the data in their company's employee data was abused. And that kind of helps to raise awareness for the delete policies.
Well, yes, just to illustrate what Professor Spiekermann has just said, my authority has jurisdiction over the German railways, and we imposed a fine of 1.1 million euros 2 years ago on this corporation after the CEO had stepped down, because not only this company had systematically spied on their employees, I'm simplifying now the facts a little bit, but also had kept information for far longer than they could legally have done. So there you see real consequences if the law is broken, at least in Germany. And I want to get back to what Scott Shipman said. I agree with you that it's not good enough solely to concentrate on the collection of data, but you must not leave it out of the focus. Data minimization, and there I disagree strongly with Peter Swire, what Peter Swire said yesterday. Data minimization is a key issue, and I can see that companies have a legitimate economic interest to collect as much data as possible, but at the same time they should say for which purpose these data are needed, and the amount of time the data may be stored is limited to that purpose. It is not unlimited storage, which is legal, and with some very rare exceptions. That's, I think, a key issue.
So I guess the question that always brings to my mind is, what if my purpose is to sell you advertising over a really long period of time? I mean, it seems like one can articulate a purpose that is both, you know, a legitimate business need and for a really long time of data storage.
Yes, but then the question is, I mean, here we come into the discussion of whom do you target, and targeted advertising is a very hot issue right now after the European Union has strengthened its e-privacy directive, and the new legal framework for data protection, I'm confident, will be stricter again in the general data protection field. So if you want to run an advertising business, you have to make sure to what extent and in what circumstances you are collecting and processing personal data, and to what extent you allow the data subjects to opt out of this scheme and not to not to receive advertisements, for instance. This is a special issue in social networks also, taking into account that advertising is the main financing model and business model for most of these web services.
Sarah wanted to jump in, then we can go to Scott.
Yeah, just because you want to sell to your customer for a very long time doesn't mean that you need to store customer profiles for a very long time. Customers' life cycles can be subtracted from their timely purchase basket, for example. And you can also take contextual data that allows you to see what status a customer is in. So in order to do customer life cycle analysis and in order to do targeted advertisement, you don't need very long purchase and profile histories. You don't.
Scott.
We were talking about nudges, and I think an appropriate nudge to highlight is one that the FTC gave to most of the U.S. companies back in the late 06, early 07, and it was then that they said, we're going to look at behavioral advertising, and over the next year we're going to hold a number of workshops, and we want more information from you, industry. And from an eBay perspective, that was enough of a nudge. And even though we're not search, we're not an ad network, we're not a data broker, we took a look at our community, our customers, and thought there has to be a way we can communicate better to them when we're using the information they provide us to target an ad that's on our website. And so by the time the FTC held a fun, an aptly named conference called the Behavioral Advertising Workshop in the fall of that year in November, we had developed and patent pended a link that we put on our ads and says Ad Choice. And subsequent to that, we've seen a number in the industry over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've seen many industry announcements, certainly this year, where there is a large growing body of companies in the US that have adopted or are in the process of adopting an on-ad link concept that tells consumers whether or not an ad is targeted to them and what they can do about it. I don't know if I can flip to that page. I can actually show you what it looks like on eBay if I can figure this out.
The other direction, there you go.
All right. I'm going to have to flip through a bunch of...
That's okay.
Just close your eye. There we go.
Yeah.
So, while I apologize because this is probably a little bit of an eye chart for you, if you were to see an ad on eBay or an ad off of eBay, advertising eBay, you would see a link on that ad, and it will say Ad Choice. When you click on that link, you get the pop-up message to the right with the eBay logo there, and it says About Ad Choice Advertising Preferences. And it tells you that this ad has been targeted to you based on how we know you, based on your interaction with eBay. Now this is first-party advertising, right? This is not third-party advertising where we're getting data from someone else about you. This is your interactions on eBay. And we then tell you that if you want to change these preferences, you can click on these 2 links below, and it'll direct you to our website where you can express your interest, right? So on the left side of the screen, what you see is the website screenshot, right? And we offer you 2 different types of choices. One choice is a cookie-based opt-out. So if you are not necessarily, you're not signed in, or you're not registered, or you don't want to sign in right now, you're busy doing other things, you can opt out based on a cookie. And the other is you can actually sign in and change your preference. Now if you sign in and change your preference, that means we store that preference, which means you will not be targeted based on your behavior for an eBay ad, period, until you change your mind. So there's been a lot of debate about whether or not cookie-based is the appropriate way or server-based is the appropriate way. We think they're both appropriate in different contexts. So this is an example of a nudge that the FTC gave to businesses. And if you look at the time to innovation, while we were able, because we're not an ad network, nor are we search, we were able to innovate on our own platform quite quickly in less than 8 months. But what we're seeing is in as short of a period of time as less than 3 years, that we now have the industry leaders within the US coalescing on ad labeling with links to provide consumers these types of choices. So to me, I think that's a great example of a nudge and a technological reaction. A question that I have actually for Lori or others is where we see areas like P3P or other types of things that haven't been adopted. Is it because we haven't had the appropriate nudge, or is it because technologies don't necessarily express a benefit as easily as this? I don't know.
Yeah, my opinion is that we haven't had the incentives, be it the regulatory nudge or whatever, that I think people have expressed a number of technology complaints about P3P, and I think those are all fixable. If there was a will, the working group that created P3P could get together again and fix all the technology problems pretty easily, but I think it's a real incentive problem. And the FTC has never told anybody they have to adopt P3P or told them they'd have any benefit from doing so. The only people who've ever been required or even nudged to do it are either people who use third-party cookies, which Microsoft will block in IE, and U.S. government websites, which are required to adopt P3P, and even they don't always do it. So I think incentives are a big issue.
I have a question for Scott. What happens if I don't use these options and I don't click of any of these points? What happens in my eBay profile?
So, and I think I know where you're going with this, which is what is the default? and within eBay, we, just as if you come to eBay and you type in red fire truck, contextually ads will be served to you to display red fire trucks, right? So within our first, and that's why I say first party, your interaction within eBay absolutely governs how the site is displayed, the types of items you can see, as well as the advertisements. Now, if you are off of eBay on another internet property and we want you to come back, we will absolutely put an ad in front of you with a red Tonka fire truck if you had an unsuccessful search recently and we know you might still be interested in a red Tonka fire truck. If you do nothing, the default is we use your activities on our platform, but we don't share that with third parties, right? This is not the third party type of situation. That's the default. And that actually reminds me of another concept with the defaults, which is defaults change over time. And I understand many of the difficulties that Facebook is currently having with defaults, because certainly eBay has experienced them as well. In the late 90s and early 2000s, eBay was a very small website. We were about, in 97, 98, we were about the size of the state of Iowa. So not millions and millions and hundreds of millions of people. And I pick Iowa because it's in the center of the U.S. It's considered kind of the breadbasket. It's not a lot of crime, just kind of a happy community. And with eBay at that time, any member of eBay could request the information of any other member. Name, address, phone, email. That was the functionality of the website, right? And in exchange, you received the contact information of the other person. Now that functionality doesn't exist today. Over the years, and as we've grown, and to the size of New York City, and larger than many third world countries, there is certainly an element that is not the same as Iowa, and we certainly have more abuses. And so with those abuses, we've had to restrict the amount of information as a default that gets shared. And so I think that as we're seeing a number of these new business models emerge, they are trying to keep up with the evolving norms from being a college type of website to being a large global website. And they've got some good people, and I think that we're seeing early indications that they're trying to keep up with those changes. But the defaults do change, and not always for the more open, right? And certainly in our context, we restricted the amount of information that was shared because it was the right thing to do for our consumers.
So I want to switch gears a little bit, and I think you've given us a bit of a good segue. Some of these tools we've talked about depend on consumers doing something, and we've talked a little about the defaults, the role of the defaults in kind of counteracting the consumer's need to do something. And I know Sarah and Lori have done some work together on kind of this question of design, what kind of design features computer engineers can incorporate that would help solve that problem. And I think you need to go in the other direction. Maybe there you go. So I'd ask you to share some of that thinking.
I'm still looking for the slide. It's not there anymore.
keep going, maybe?
There it is.
Yeah, it's unfortunately not there.
No?
Well, not there. Anyways, yeah, Laurie and I have been actually raising the question, if you need controls, yeah, privacy tools to protect yourself, actually the baby has been already drowned with the bath. I think that's the way you say it in English. And
thrown out with the bathwater, right?
Thrown out with the bath water.
Not drowned. Although
Well,
surely it's not good for it to be thrown out, right?
And this slide is missing. I don't know why it's gone.
I'll try to find it while you talk.
Yeah. So, hold on. This slide, actually, just keep it for a second. So we have been asking the question: could we not build technology from the start in such a way that data collection is minimized, and that we have privacy by design, but real privacy by design? And we have come up with two central dimensions that determine a privacy by design. And one is the x-axis that you see here, and we called it the degree of network centricity. What does that mean? It means to what extent, also who controls basically the data processing? Is that data processing happening on the network, or is it happening with the user? A very good example is GPS versus, also pure GPS versus assisted GPS. If you have a very privacy-friendly system if you take a pure GPS device that calculates the location based on the satellite data on the device, and may then pull services from the network to inform the user. But, of course, operators have an interest to use assisted GPS, not in order to make the positioning better, but in order to provide content services and be aware of where their mobile users are moving and what they're doing. So assisted GPS would have a much higher degree of network centricity. But what the example basically shows is that the magic of data collection and service delivery, the magic for privacy, resides in the architecture. And in this case, the degree of network centricity. The second dimension we came up with is the degree of person identifiability that is built into the system. Perhaps you'll find the slide now. I hope very much that you find it. Because it's the key slide we developed in order to understand where does actually personal data, in the sense of the EU directives, that means personally identifiable data, start. It's a key question. Where does personally identifiable data start? And now I hear that with the new EU directive, there is a trend towards agreeing that that an IP number based on IPv6 or an EPC in an RFID tag, or potentially a cookie, is a personally identifiable piece of data. The way Laurie and I defined it, and I'm really sorry that you don't have the slide on here, is that we said, if you have common identifiers across databases, if it is easy to link an identifier with some personal profile data at the back end with reasonable effort, then you are in the space of personal or personally identifiable data. If you, as a provider though, if you make a big effort and try to impede the linking of an identifier with profile data by, for example, not using unique identifiers across databases, by using random identifiers, by regularly deleting your profile data, by not having common attributes across databases, if you work towards that, then you build non-identifiability into your architecture. And we call that Yeah, we call it privacy by architecture. Do you want to comment or complete what I said, or something on your mind?
Oh, yeah, that's good.
Okay, so this is basically, so we were actually runners-up for the PET Award with our paper on privacy engineering, where you can find all of that information. The source, I think, should be published.
Okay, thank you. I did want to, I'm glad you went back to the slide, because I wanted to ask Lori a question based on the interesting work that Alessandro Acquisti showed us yesterday. How did you decide, where he kind of indicated that even your font choice impacts the way people perceive their privacy, and he really, I think, raises this really important question of the kind of risks of giving people a false sense of control, which means then that they share even more when in fact they haven't, gotten any increased privacy protection. It just makes me wonder how you came up with the duck.
So we had previously built a tool called Privacy Bird, mostly because we wanted some animated character to represent it, and you could think of it like the canary in the coal mine sort of thing. So that's why he's there. But yeah, it does make a difference how you portray it. And actually, in the study that we did, we tried to make it as neutral as possible, and we actually removed the word privacy from the bird and tried to really neutralize it.
So I think I'd like to turn now to some of the RFID information we thought we'd share with you today. I want to do it a little earlier than I thought to make sure that it works. So we're going to go to that slide, and we're going to try to launch this video, technology willing.
Yeah. Could you please?
And then we're going to talk a little about kind of what all of these concepts mean in the future when we're looking more at an Internet of Things than kind of the web surfing environment we have today.
Could you turn on the sound, please? Yeah. And make it large, please?
Spoke too soon. Try again.
Yeah, let's try again.
Maybe the big was a mistake. We're using the internet here, so that's a dangerous game.
Okay, unfortunately, it doesn't work. I'm really sorry again. But you saw a very important sequence of the film. The film simulates what happens if the RFID infrastructure is not well planned right now. So the film takes actually the view of a camera, and the camera bundled with a RFID application that combines the visual data with the RFID data, and if you have a UHF frequency being used on your tags that you wear in your clothes, you can immediately target a person, look at what that person is wearing. If you have access to the EPCIS or the EPC global network, as GS1 calls it, you can really see who is moving through a mall, what kind of objects and textiles is that person wearing. It may just be a number, as you then also see in the video later on, but this number is meaningful and identifiable if you have access to the right systems. And of course, and this is why this slide is called "If the RFID infrastructure is not well planned," this is a horror scenario. This is a scenario that could become true if we did not build privacy into the RFID infrastructure right now. And we have been thinking about how we can basically how we can protect people from this kind of scenario. And here you have all the options basically we are currently thinking about in the technology world. And number one is, of course, to kill tags. And we've talked about this earlier here on the podium, the possibility to kill RFID chips that are embedded in your products when you move out of the store. But retailers are, of course, very much opposed to killing the tags in the short term because of very huge upfront investments. That's understandable. But also in the long run, we have a lot of visions, ubiquitous computing services, the smart fridge and everything that's building basically of tags being also continuing to be alive. The second option is to just click away the tag or destroy it. And probably the most interesting and important privacy enhancing technology here is to deactivate tags. So in the long run, we would hope that as products are moving out of the store, they are by default, also they are deactivated, but they can be switched on again later on if customers are coming back in order to return products. And this is exactly where we are again at the slide. Where is RFID here? So what we want to try is we want to minimize identifiability by already building the RFID infrastructure in such a way that this scenario doesn't become true. And RFID operators have a lot of options in how to design the RFID infrastructure. One thing today already, they can restrict the storage and use of tags unique identifiers, and they can abstain from creating identifier customer profiles. The thing is though, and here we are again in this industry consent, what was it called this morning, that the industry is...
the self-regulatory model?
The self-regulatory approach. The question is, of course, will operators self-regulate themselves to abstain from collecting data that makes economic sense for them potentially? And I don't know to what extent that's possible. Certainly right now we have a political debate in Europe because the self-regulatory approach is being tested. And it's being tested basically on RFID. And the EU has published a recommendation last May where they say, please, in RFID operators, self-regulate yourself with the help of privacy impact assessments. And make sure you come up with a way to build RFID and operate RFID infrastructure in a privacy-friendly manner. But what this privacy impact assessment will look like is still a matter of very, very heavy debates.
Well, I'm sorry we can't see the video, but I guess we'll have to use our imaginations. Did you want to add anything to that, Alexander?
Just wanted to add what Sarah Spiekermann has just said. The Article 29 Working Party has been offered a first draft of this privacy impact assessment by RFID producers or association of RFID manufacturers, and this was considered by the Article 29 Working Party. This first draft was considered to be completely unsatisfactory, and it wasn't accepted, so they still have to work on better proposals there. But I think it's certainly could be a good tool to actually inject privacy methodology into the technology as Sarah Spiekermann has illustrated. I want to add one more piece to that. I'm sure you know it, but maybe the audience doesn't know it. There is also a low-tech way to construct privacy-friendly RFID tags. I think it was developed by IBM researchers, although it's a low-tech solution. These technologists came up with this idea. Think about watches. Watches usually have, wristband watches have long-term guarantees, and you throw away the receipt, and after 4 years the guarantee is still running. The watch doesn't work anymore, and you go back to the store and want to have it repaired under guarantee. Now, how can the dealer find out that it was actually bought in his shop without the receipt? You can have a RFID tag where the buyer breaks out part of the circuit after he has paid for it and reinserts it when he wants to demonstrate and prove that he has bought the watch at that store. It's very much low tech, but it's another way of actually giving the consumer and the data subject the power to re-identify this piece of this watch. This is just, as I said, you don't have to invest much in all instances, especially in long-term or products with a long life cycle. I'm not talking about yogurts and that sort of thing, but wristwatches. It's quite realistic that I don't have the receipt anymore, but I want to be able to prove that I bought this watch at that shop. So that could be a possible way to do it.
Well, it kind of interestingly brings us back to this idea that it takes, kind of cooperation of everybody in the chain to really end up at a real privacy-centric, environment. Scott, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other kind of identity management and digital wallet kind of technologies that people are talking about out there that are being developed that put a lot of, I think, power in the consumer's hands, and will have to overcome these barriers of consumer adoption, but are being looked at as models.
Sure, and basically I can speak briefly on some of the other different technologies that PayPal is in the process of developing. And currently in San Francisco, there's a large developers conference that PayPal is hosting, where they've now opened up the platform to allow others to innovate, leveraging the PayPal infrastructure, so enabling people to pay without sharing their financial information via the cell phone or whatever devices may come. But largely, it's just a premise that I throw out there, which is to, I guess, a little bit of shock. I came here and I was warned that make sure I put my wallet in my front pocket when I go into the old city, and to be careful for pickpockets. And I've found actually nothing like that. But that concept that we all have our identity and our payment instrument in our pocket, in our wallet, is a concept that has lasted for a very long time. People have been carrying money and their identity with them in hard copy form, yet we live in a digital era. And one of the key focuses that PayPal is working on is protecting that wallet from that pickpocket. If your wallet is encrypted and they take it, who cares? You haven't lost anything. My phone has a password. If my identity is in my phone and my financial instruments are in my phone and my phone is pickpocketed, I don't care. I can go to the nearest store, activate a new phone, and I haven't lost anything except for a piece of hardware. And so that's very much the focus of where PayPal is, and I think where we're seeing other companies as well. And so, by way of example, I boarded the plane with my phone. I didn't have a boarding pass. I went to the United website and did the electronic boarding, and up came a square barcode that I waved over a little red piece of glass, and I boarded the plane. That was my identity, right? Now, I still did need my passport to get through the customs clearance, okay? But, so in my phone, I have my identity and my wallet. I can, if someone else has an iPhone, I can bump phones and send them money. Just like that. And so those are the concepts where we're looking at, are there technologies that fundamentally, yes, you could say PayPal is about financial payments, certainly, but are there companies out there like PayPal that are building technologies that fundamentally provide additional levels of protection for your data? The answer is, absolutely, clearly yes.
So do you see any tension with that kind of model, with the kind of privacy by architecture that regime that you guys talked about earlier, where you've got maybe, it seems to me, not being the computer scientist, that you're putting a lot of functionality then in the network or the cloud or whatever you want to call it, and does that create some tension with the scheme you had laid out?
No, I'm not sure that there's tension in there. There's a variety of different ways that you can achieve privacy by architecture, and there's a variety of different levers. And so, in the two-dimensional graph that Sarah showed, blowing it up again. No. One lever had to do with the network centrality, but if you make sure that you have de-identified data, that as an example, you can still achieve high levels of privacy by architecture even if you have a network-centric system. And there are a bunch of other levers that are not even shown here. So I think we can adjust all of these things. You don't have to be perfect on every axis in order to achieve reasonable amounts of privacy here.
And just a comment on that. I mean, a great example is when eBay acquired PayPal, eBay encrypted credit card numbers and allowed the last 4 digits to be displayed to a customer support rep, but not anything else. And PayPal encrypted credit card numbers and displayed the first 3 and the last 2. Right? And so by design, both companies were working on the same premise to protect the information from even being viewed internally. But because there isn't a standard necessarily, there was actually, I was going to say months, it was years of work to change the encryption algorithms so that the 2 customer support service centers could figure out and provide the appropriate level of support, because one was encrypting in a different way than the other. So that's the architecture piece that I think is helpful.
Well, let's talk for a second. We'll get to do some audience questions, but let's just round out this section by talking about what kind of nudges can we get from a legal framework that both incent some of these behaviors, but also don't limit what you just laid out as an example of people solving the problem different ways. And we talk a lot about flexibility and the need for innovation, and then we talk about the role of the regulator. We've talked a little bit about where the regulator says you better solve this problem or else, and I think we saw that in the U.S. with the advertising guidelines that I think resulted in some significant progress on behavioral advertising transparency. You talked a little about the RFID example, which you're still hoping for a good result, but you basically said, here's a problem, go solve it. What can we do that is maybe less problem by problem based and sets up a more broader framework so we don't have to be kind of chasing the baby back from the bathwater, as some of the, once we identify a problem, it's usually a little, some of the genie is out of the bottle at that point, and it's certainly harder to get people together to solve it. So what could be more of a broader framework that would work?
Well, I can give you one example from an entirely different angle, or in a more general fashion, how regulators have approached this issue. And this is an example, in fact, where Europe has, in fact, learned from the United States legal framework. In the U.S., vast majority of U.S. states have data breach notification laws. and they've turned out to be extremely useful to raise awareness for issues of data security, but not only data security, but also privacy, I would claim. And at the same time, they have raised, and they have nudged, I would term it, the processors of these data, the controllers of these databases, to raise the level of security, because publicity is an incentive to get better, or rather a disincentive to leak data, to have data leaked to third parties. And this model is now being imported in the European legal framework, and we have it in our new German data protection law. It's part of the European e-privacy directive, and the European Commission is likely to extend breach notification obligations beyond the telecommunications and internet sphere. So that's a very general legislative nudge, if you like, and I think it could turn out to be an extremely useful one.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think actually you used the word legislative nudge, and I really like that, because I think nudging has been used more in the context of the consumer, so how to nudge him to be more aware, but I think that much more power lies in the legal nudges. That's a final statement from my side on this one.
Lori, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys talked about Europe. I think in the U.S. we've seen some legal nudging, but not all that much. And as far as thinking about it kind of more proactively, I think we need to see more companies thinking about privacy by design at the design phase and not trying to retrofit later. And really, I'm getting the thumbs up from Anne back there. But we really need to, as we innovate, keep privacy in mind. And I think that that's going to go a long way to really help instead of patching later.
Perhaps I would like to just comment on this one. In the self-regulatory approach to RFID regulation, the idea was to report on the privacy architecture or on the system architecture 6 weeks prior to the launch. That's what industry proposed. And it is unacceptable, because it would ruin privacy by design, which needs to set in much earlier in the design phase, probably months and months before the system is actually launched. So if there is self-regulation, fine. But in the self-regulation document, it should be said that the self-regulation process starts, a reporting process starts really early, in order for the data protection people or the engineers to fix problems in the architecture.
Scott?
I think just briefly, we've seen a number of U.S. companies nudging the federal government for federal privacy law now since 2006. And there's another example of a nudge, probably one that many people didn't anticipate. And so eBay is certainly one of those companies, and continue to work with not only the U.S. but many others on whether it's coming up with dispute resolution mechanisms within the EU for consumers or other types of things. Our focus is the consumer, and so we will continue to nudge where we can.
Okay, I think we have a few minutes left for some nudges from the audience if people have any questions. I don't know that we have a microphone system, so you just have to be loud. So say who you are, and oh, nope, they have a mic. Okay, still say who you are. Oh, go ahead, Anne. Then you can be next.
Privacy Commissioner, Ontario, Canada. I just wanted to
Wait a second, it's not on. They're going to come.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted with the comments you've made, and I just want to add to a few of them. Lori, the point you made about, oh, sorry, it was Sarah, the 6 weeks in advance, the RFID thing, completely unacceptable. Of course, if you're going to do privacy by design and build it into RFID, especially consumer-facing ones, you must do it at the design stage. And I just want to tell you, we're working with Elizabeth Board in the United States, and Canada to do exactly that in terms of consumer-facing RFIDs, EPC Global and GS1. So it's not that they're not necessarily receptive, but you've got to get there, because precisely privacy by design has to be engaged at the design stage. It is proactive by nature. It's often called privacy by default because the default feature is essential. It's a raising of the bar, but I think there are significant incentives to businesses to do that, because when you, as Alexander was saying, when you engage in data minimization, which is a key component of privacy by design, you create enormous incentives for businesses, because they no longer have to they don't have a duty of care associated with personally identifiable data that they collect, which they then must keep secure, which they must protect against data breaches and all of the actions that may result once all that takes place. So there are ways to appeal to them. The real comment I want to make, though, you have one slide up there. It was about a privacy impact assessment. If you could just pull that, because I just want to disagree with that a little bit, mildly. Of course, I'm in favor of privacy impact assessments when they're done right, but the problem is privacy impact assessments in many jurisdictions, including my own in the past, have been treated as okay, it's a checkbox, and oh yeah, we did it, and it sits in the box, and then they go do whatever they're going to do, and it's unrelated to action. So in order for it to be linked to privacy by design, I always say it's got to be PIA that is acted upon. You've got to demonstrate that action results from the risks identified in the PIA, and then measures taken to remedy those risks. That's what makes it a PBD.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree with you. And the current status we are in right now is that the PR1 report that was proposed is just looking at reporting. The checking of the box, I reported. And what we are now trying to work towards is that we embed there a process of mitigation, a process of privacy risk identification, and a reporting of what kind of mitigation strategies have been taken. And this is what we are trying to achieve. And we are in the middle of that. But thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you.
Stuart Dresner, Chief Executive, Privacy Laws and Business. My question is to Laurie Craner. I was very impressed by your Privacy Finder program. First time I've heard of it, and I think it's a marvelous thing to have some software that can analyze privacy programs to give a rating on their complexity. So I think this is really good. And my question to you is, do you take into account the length of the privacy policy? Because there are some privacy policies that are quite clear in their wording, and I'll give you the example of LinkedIn, but it's very, very long. And I think that I'm the only person in the world to have ever read the privacy policy of LinkedIn, and I could ask anyone here if anyone's ever read it all, but it did take me an hour, and I think just because it's very long, it should get negative marks. So that's the question.
Yeah, so Privacy Finder is actually doing all the analysis based on the computer-readable P3P policies. So we're not looking at the English or French or German or whatever at all in that. And it was built as a demonstration of what you could do with P3P if we had widespread adoption of P3P.
Lori, I think you should give a couple minutes on P3P, it sounds like.
Okay. Never turn down an opportunity to talk about P3P. So P3P is an XML-based, that's a computer-readable language for privacy policies. It was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, which does HTML and all the other languages for the web. And basically, we spent about 6 years, the working group that had representatives from industry and nonprofits and the data protection agencies, trying to come up with the vocabulary for privacy. Because if you're going to have a computer language, you first have to figure out the human language for privacy before you can translate it into the computer language. So P3P now has this computer language for privacy, and websites can just basically take their privacy policy and translate it into the computer language and put it on their website. Once they've done that, then Privacy Finder can go and read it, Internet Explorer can go and read it, and anybody else who wants to build a P3P tool could go and read it and take it and interpret it however they want. So if you don't like the criteria that we used for the privacy meters in Privacy Finder, you could come up with your own criteria, build your own tool. Everybody could have their own criteria. Users could have their own preference settings. Part of the original vision was that a user could decide, well, these are the things that are important to me, and have their tool flag the things that they want.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. And I think we had one more question back here. We probably have time for maybe one or two.
Thank you. Two observations. One of them, sorry, Malcolm Crompton here. What have I just done? Have I just burst the microphone? Sorry. Two observations. One of them is that, and they're both about the privacy nudges by the regulatory framework. I thought what Scott was saying before was good. But what we're watching is the problem of almost all the nudging is at the big guys, and all the nasty stuff is done by the little guys, the little startup websites, the guy in the shed. And I'm not quite sure that anything that we've talked about is really giving them much of a regulatory nudge at all to do the right thing. And I'm going to ask the commentators to give us some thoughts on that. I'll give you another thought to use, possibly starting with the big people though, which is to do an analogy with the Standard & Poor's credit risk rating process, where you get a credit risk rating which is done against a standardised format, and you get that number for your company, and then people will lend to you on that basis. Cost of borrowings go up if you're a risky borrower. Why not have P&S ratings, privacy and security ratings, done the same way? We've written a paper about this in 2007, and I suggest 3 dimensions at least in such a risk rating formula. One of them is a risk rating based upon the nature of the privacy promise you want to make, with the median point being current privacy law, and the company actually stating where it's going to go below that or go above that. Your privacy risk rating goes up or down accordingly. The second dimension in the formula relates to how well you're going to prove you're abiding by your promise. Are you just going to wave your finger in the wind, have internal audit, have external accreditation? Third part of the dimension is how well you manage failure from a customer's perspective. When things go wrong, how do you look after the customer? Management of failure is a stunningly poorly managed thing in the privacy arena. If you can come up with a privacy risk rating where you get 1 if you're really good, 100 if you're really bad, business choice, but then that risk rating may in fact affect your ability to borrow because you're seen as a risky company or a good company. It may affect how the customer wants to deal with you. It may even affect regulatory design. Let's make the fines that you pay for an indiscretion formula based upon a weighting of some sort, times your privacy risk rating times fines units, which is how we do things in the Australian law. We just say 10 penalty units or 20 penalty units, whatever, to make an inflation adjustment really easy. In that way, you can use the law to further drive the market. But the important thing is to get to Scott's point when I say this, is you need a fairly smooth mechanism for nudging people in the right direction, because otherwise we've got clunky steps, and as a designer of regulation I know as soon as you put in clunky steps, you've got people wanting to hop to either side of that clunky step depending on what's good for them. You need smooth drivers. What I've just suggested provides a smooth driver, it drives the marketplace, and you can design law around it. And this might provide some of what Scott is on about without having to actually put it in the law.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to take my prerogative and call on Pat Walsh, who's going to, I think, address the first point you raised about what we do with all the many, many players who need to get in line here. And
well, cheers, me. It's a question for Sarah, really. I like the idea about network centricity and the degrees of network centricity and privacy by design. And you mentioned the mobile, but there's an increasing disintermediation between the user and the operator. A user is enmeshed in a web of relationships with entities based around the world that operate across fragmented platforms, OS systems. What sort of nudge do you think it would take to bring those key parties together to find a solution and deliver consistent privacy experiences?
That's a very tough question. The question is really how much of the intelligence you are embedding and processing on the device, and how much on the network, and what nature do network service providers have? What is their business model? If I just pull social network data from that service provider and have a smart application on my device that basically then shows me my friends that are online, and we can build architectures like that. However, I agree to the challenge that we have, because business models we don't have business models right now that would incentivize the building of this kind of architecture for the mobile arena. But Laurie and I finally have been thinking in more general terms about what would be crucial across applications and devices for privacy. And if you look, for example, into RFID, we still do have an option, depending on legislation, to build privacy by design and to have user-controlled RFID architectures. For example, people provide a password and then retrieve a service. It's a completely different architecture than having everything governed on the net. However, this means that right now deactivation, or at least password protection of tags, is so spread into the world that the resulting architecture allows for that. Yeah, you want to?
Can I respond?
Yeah, you can.
I don't know if I need a mic to hear me.
Perhaps you.
This is extremely fragmented, so you might have 10 different operating systems, and you have applications developed for those different operating systems. And to take the point Malcolm earlier, some comments from yesterday about taking innovation of privacy by design to the street, it is a reality that Fred in the Shed actually does develop apps, and that person may be in Timbuktu or Wagga Wagga in Australia, it could be in the US. So how do you bring those different parties together? How do you architecture for that? And is it the platforms that you go to, or?
Yeah, so I think the platforms are kind of the gatekeepers here. And one of the things is that you have all of these developers who are not necessarily trained in privacy or anything, right? And they just get this development toolkit and they hack something together and they put it out there. It would be great if the development platform had privacy guidelines built into it and had privacy checks built into it so that the developer doesn't have to know to go do it. And that's something that I would love to see.
I'm going to go to Scott. We're way over time, so we have about 2 minutes, and then we have to go to lunch, I think.
Just a real quick concept, and I completely agree with what you're illustrating. The interesting component here is that it's not just mobile, right? It exists on the web today. And a simple example, without naming all the names, but people have PayPal accounts. They receive emails from PayPal. The sheer fact that the email provider can take the knowledge that PayPal is sending an individual an email, they now know that someone has a PayPal account. And that information today can be done with however the email provider chooses. So to me, the nudge is we need baseline federal privacy law in the United States so that if you're a common carrier, you can't take content and use it for other purposes, because it's not just about the consumer in that context. We're talking about competitive advantages or disadvantages. eBay should get into the email service business if that's the case, so that we can know what our competitors are up to. Right? Of course, we're not going to do that.
And it needs to apply not only to the telecom players who've already been regulated, but to everybody, because we now have a variety of different types of companies, and Apple isn't a telecom company, and it needs to apply to them too.
Okay, so we're going to have to end, and we're going to give Mr. Dix, who had the first word, the last word as well.
Thank you very much. Well, in this point, on the last note, I strongly agree with Scott. We do need privacy regulation in the United States, and we do need international standards for privacy protection. And on that note, we are seeing that an international regulatory nudge is approaching. I might call it that way, because the International Standards Organization is working on a framework for privacy protection. That sounds, and privacy commissions have been involved in that standard, so that could be a possible way to solve some of the problems that have been described. But I still would like to get rid of some very privacy unfriendly nudges. They are also out there in some of the web services. I'm not going to name Facebook again, but they are among these crowds. And nudges are not only positive, but we have to work for innovative, privacy-friendly apps also. I'm looking for many privacy apps, and we need standardization in this business. So what I'm dreaming of is a clocky-like nudge for privacy protection. So alarm clock which jumps off of the nightstand and only stops ringing once I actually caught it. That's what we need.
All right, thank you all for coming.
Thank you. You did a great job moderating.
I don't think it was me.
The back half of